Hello, everyone. This week we are beginning chapter 2, where we move into a new way of thinking about aging. In the first chapter, we focused on the social construction of aging and the sociological imagination. We talked about how society gives meaning to age and how individual experiences of aging are connected to larger social structures. We then used those ideas to examine age inequality and ageism. Chapter 2 takes us into the idea of the risk society. This is a concept associated with sociologist Ulrich Beck, and Powell uses it to examine how contemporary societies understand risk, responsibility, and aging. The basic idea behind a risk society is that modern life produces new kinds of risks and uncertainties. Some of these risks are created by the very systems that are supposed to make our lives safer, healthier, and more secure. At the same time, individuals are increasingly expected to manage risks for themselves. This becomes particularly interesting when we apply the idea of risk to aging. Living longer is obviously a positive development in many ways. Improvements in medicine, public health, nutrition, and living conditions have allowed people to survive diseases and conditions that once would have shortened their lives. But as populations live longer, governments and institutions also begin asking questions about the economic and social consequences of population aging. How will people support themselves during longer retirements? Who will provide health care? Who will provide long term care? How will pension systems be funded? Who will pay for those services? And perhaps most importantly, who is responsible for preparing for these risks? Powell's discussion is largely focused on Britain, so some of the specific policies and examples in Chapter 2 are British. But the larger sociological questions are much broader. The same questions about responsibility, retirement, pensions, healthcare, and population aging are important in the United States. This is where our supplemental reading, What is New with Old? What old age teaches us about inequality and stratification becomes particularly useful. Corey Abramson and Elena Portocoloni argue that aging should be much more central to the sociological study of inequality in the United States. Their argument is actually quite simple, but it has significant implications. Aging is unequal. Not everyone has the same opportunity to grow old, and not everyone experiences old age under the same conditions. The authors point out that some Americans live well into their 80s and beyond, while others die before they ever reach the age at which they would qualify for Social Security. These differences are not simply random biological outcomes. They reflect durable inequalities related to race, socioeconomic status, and gender that accumulate throughout people's lives. This connects directly to something we discussed last week. Remember when we talked about age inequality and the idea that age can become a dimension of stratification? Abramson and Portocoloni are asking us to take that idea even further. They argue that aging is both an outcome of inequality and a process that can produce inequality. Let's unpack that. First, aging is an outcome of inequality. People arrive at later life after living through decades of different social circumstances. Someone who has had stable employment, good education, adequate income, safe housing, access to health care, and strong social networks may arrive at older adulthood with very different resources from someone who has experienced poverty, discrimination, unsafe housing, limited health care, or unstable employment. In other words, we do not all arrive at old age with the same starting point. The authors describe these patterns as durable inequalities. Inequalities experienced earlier in life can continue to shape people's health, life expectancy, social relationships, resources, and experiences in later life. This is an important connection to the sociological imagination. If we see an older person who is struggling financially, we might be tempted to ask what that individual did wrong. Why didn't they save more? Why didn't they get a better job? Why didn't they make better choices? But the sociological imagination encourages us to ask a different set of questions. What kind of employment opportunities did this person have? What was happening in the economy when they entered the workforce? Did they experience racial or gender discrimination? Did they have access to education? Did they have health problems that affected their ability to work? Did they have family responsibilities that interrupted their career? Did they have access to employer sponsored retirement benefits? Did they live in a community with good resources? When we ask these questions, we begin to see how an individual's situation in later life can reflect decades of social conditions. This is one reason that the authors argue that old age provides such an important window into the study of inequality. By the time people reach later life, the effects of many earlier experiences have had decades to accumulate. The article also makes a second important argument. Aging is not only an outcome of inequality, aging itself can become a source of inequality. In other words, being old in a society that places a high value on youth can affect people's opportunities and experiences. Think about employment. An older worker may have extensive experience and knowledge, but they may also encounter assumptions that they are less adaptable, less technologically capable, or less valuable to an employer. Think about healthcare. Older adults may have greater healthcare needs, but access to healthcare and the ability to navigate healthcare systems are not distributed equally. Think about neighborhoods. The authors point out that more affluent older adults may move into communities with extensive services and resources, while other older adults may remain in neighborhoods with fewer resources. So, even when people face some of the same challenges associated with aging, they may face those challenges with very different resources available to them. This is what makes aging such a powerful sociological lens. Almost everyone who survives long enough will eventually encounter some of the physical and social challenges associated with later life. People may experience declining mobility, changes in health, the death of friends or partners, or changes in their work and family roles. But people do not encounter those challenges under identical circumstances. Someone with financial resources may be able to modify their home, hire assistance, move to a supportive community, or access specialized healthcare. Someone without those resources may have far fewer options. The problem may look similar on the surface, but the available solutions are very different. This is one of the most important ideas from this week's reading. Similar problems do not necessarily produce similar experiences because people have unequal resources with which to respond to them. That is a very sociological way of thinking about aging. It also helps us understand why the concept of risk is so important. Risk is not distributed equally. The risk of experiencing financial insecurity in old age is not the same for everyone. The risk of poor health is not the same for everyone. The risk of needing long term care is not experienced under the same circumstances by everyone, and the consequences of those risks are not the same for everyone. This brings us back to Powell's discussion of the risk society. One of the concerns Powell raises is that contemporary societies increasingly encourage individuals to take responsibility for managing the risks associated with their own aging. As populations grow older and welfare systems face financial pressures, people may be encouraged to work longer, save more, invest in private pensions, and take greater responsibility for their own future. Powell discusses this particularly in relation to Britain, where policies encouraging longer working lives developed partly in response to concerns about the economic consequences of population aging. The sociological question is not whether individuals should make responsible decisions. Of course, individual decisions matter. The question is whether we can reasonably expect everyone to manage these risks equally when people do not begin with equal resources. Imagine telling two people that they are both responsible for saving enough money for retirement. That sounds fair on the surface. But what if one person earns substantially more throughout their working life? What if one person has access to an employer sponsored pension and the other does not? What if one person has significant medical expenses? What if one person spends years providing unpaid care for a family member? What if one person experiences discrimination in the labor market? The expectation of individual responsibility may be the same, but the ability to meet that expectation is very different. This is where the idea of inequality becomes connected to the idea of risk. A society can describe something as an individual risk, while the conditions that create that risk are actually deeply social. That is one of the major themes I want you to notice in chapter 2. The way a society defines a problem influences the solutions it considers appropriate. If we define retirement insecurity as an individual failure to save enough money, we might emphasize individual responsibility. If we define retirement insecurity as a social problem influenced by wages, employment structures, discrimination, healthcare costs, and public policy, we might look for collective solutions. The same basic problem can therefore be understood very differently depending on the sociological perspective we use. And this is exactly why sociology matters. We are not simply asking whether older people are healthy, wealthy, employed, or independent. We are asking why those conditions are distributed the way they are. Who has access to resources? Who is exposed to risk? Who is expected to take responsibility? And how do social institutions shape the choices people actually have? Abramson and Portocolone ultimately argue that studying older adults can teach us something much larger about American society. Later life allows sociologists to observe the long term consequences of inequality and to see how social structures, culture, neighborhoods, health, social networks, and resources interact over time. So, although this week's article is specifically about aging in the United States, its argument connects directly to the broader ideas in Powell's chapter. Both readings encourage us to move away from the idea that aging is simply an individual process. Aging takes place within social structures. The risks associated with aging are socially organized, resources are unequally distributed, and the consequences of those inequalities can become especially visible in later life. As you finish this week's readings, I want you to think about one question. When society tells people that they are responsible for managing the risks of aging, what happens when people do not have equal resources with which to manage those risks? That question will help us connect the ideas of risk, inequality, and aging. And it will also prepare us for where we are going next week when we turn our attention more directly toward work, retirement, care, longevity, and the aging body. For now, remember that growing older may be something that happens to individuals, but the conditions under which people grow older are deeply social.